Today, on Dangerous Tides, we are examining another ship at the bottom of the Great Lakes. Much like the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Kamloops, it has also been a topic of discussion amongst old sailors, the living families of the crew, and local Michiganders, along with maritime history buffs alike. Much like the ill-fated Fitz and the Carl D. Bradley before it, it was always a stark reminder of how rough a sailor's life could be. While the Great Lakes are dangerous in their own right as forces of nature, sometimes it is human error that takes a ship. It is often said that the regulations of OSHA were written in blood, and the case of the SS Cedarville is no different. So come aboard as we set sail on Dangerous Tides. Michigan is a state that built much of its life around the Great Lakes. Chances are, if you've lived in Michigan long enough, you've either worked in the maritime industry or you know someone who has. The Great Lakes has a long-standing relationship with Michigan that not only illustrates the history of the region, but the history of world trade within the United States. The collision of the SS Cedarville is just one microcosm of the vast amount of shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. However, it doesn't receive as much attention as the Edmund Fitzgerald, when it should be just as respected. As such, we would like to remind you that we intend to treat these stories with the utmost respect and care while providing you the history of these ships. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Dangerous Tide. The SS Cedarville was built in 1927 by the Great Lakes Engineering Works Company. This would be the company that would build the Edmund Fitzgerald just 30 years. The Cedarville didn't start life out as the name of the township on the Mackinac that would be a frequent stop for her. But she began as the SS A.F. Harvey. She was commissioned to be built for the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a subsidiary of the U.S. Steel Corporation, which also owned many other companies, including the Bradley Transportation Company, who would eventually come to own the bulk carrier in the later half of her career. The SS Carl D. Bradley would serve as her fleet mate within the next 2 years of her transfer. The SS A.F. Harvey, as she was known then, was designed to carry iron ore across the Great Lakes, built at a length of 603.9 feet, or 184 meters, with a beam of 60.2 feet, or 18.3 meters. While not the largest on the lakes, she came close to it, launching April 9th, 1927. The Harvey was almost identical to other vessels in the service at the time, entering service in May of that same year. However, at the end of the first year, she would run into difficulty on the lakes near Detour Village, eerily hearkening what was to come. The Harvey would be surrounded in heavy fog, colliding with another steamer by the name of John Erickson. The Erickson was forced to be beached after the accident to prevent sinking. But the Harvey was allowed to reach Detour for repairs and inspection. She would return to service not long after, with the Erickson refloated and repaired around the same time. The Harvey would be re-registered briefly to a home port in New York, but never the Great Lakes. In 1956, she would be transferred to the Bradley Transportation Company, returning her registration to the home port of Duluth, Minnesota, though she operated in Rogers City, Michigan. During the winter layup of 1956, the carrier would receive a major overhaul at the Defoe Shipbuilding Company in Bay City. The refit would convert her from an iron ore bulk carrier to a self-unloading limestone and coal carrier. A new hopper bottom and 2 conveyor belts would run the length of the ship, carrying the cargo to a Ford-mounted bucket elevator, lifting minerals 250 feet to its self-loading boom mount just rear of the Ford cabins, along with a new modern funnel. Despite the reduction of capacity, this would make the Harvey more efficient and adaptable, allowing her to deliver cargo anywhere without the need of shore-based equipment. As part of the transfer, the Harvey would be renamed the SS Cedarville and would operate with the larger Carl D. Bradley in 1957 before the latter sank in 1958. One surviving crew member of the Bradley would be scheduled to serve on the Cedarville as the captain. The first mate of the Bradley, Elmer Fleming, had only stepped aboard for a few moments on the day of March 27, 1964, before leaving the Cedarville and the Mariner's life for good. His sudden departure would reshuffle the deck crew, promoting Martin Joppich, a mariner with 18 years' experience on the lake. Though well-liked by the crew, many found his sudden promotion to be mysterious. An even greater mystery was the reason why Fleming had left the SS Cedarville. Many had speculated that the bad weather that day triggered the trauma Fleming experienced when the Bradley went down 6 years before. Ed Brewster, a wheelsman working under Fleming, had noted him to be a real nervous person. Several mariners from the Bradley ships would join the Cedarville. On May 7th, third mate Charles Cook would depart from the SS W.F. White to serve the crew. The third mate at the time, Lynn Gabriziak, would be demoted to the wheelman, and Brewster would be demoted to watchman. Joppich would complete the 1964 season upon assuming command. In October, the Cedarville was grounded in the St. Mary's River for dry docking and repairs for the deteriorating hull. By the start of the 1965 season, it was clear that the Cedarville's hull was rapidly aging. Reports from the Coast Guard as early as spring 1961 found serious deterioration of the hull plating and ordered replacements of the affected areas starting 80 feet rear of the bow on both sides. The hull was made up of 3/8-inch steel plating, proving susceptible to corrosion, causing thinning and pitting, among other signs of weakness. Because the cost of repairs would exceed $124,000, adjusted for inflation, that is $1.31 billion today, and disrupt the busy schedule of the Cedarville, the captain preceding Joppich requested permission to delay repairs until a more convenient time. Lloyd's Registry of Shipping in London pushed the Bradley Transportation Company to invest in repairs at the insistence of the ship's insurance underwriters. However, the repairs were pushed off indefinitely. Even when the Cedarville was dry docked in 1964, Bradley refused to invest in replacing the hull plates. The Cedarville had her boiler replaced in 1961 to improve efficiency and increase power, and this would be the last major work done before the 1965 season. Joppich and the crew were well aware of the 40-year-old ship showing her age, but these issues were easy to ignore. These ships were built to be strong against the forces of the Great Lakes, and the captains and crew weren't exactly wet behind the ears. Many a Laker captain would pride themselves in pushing their vessels to the limit. The Bradley Transportation Fleet was responsible for delivering vital ingredients of steel production to the U.S. Steel's industrial empire. Limestone was a way to remove impurities during the blast process. Bradley would give extremely optimistic schedules and tonnage requirements with no regard for weather or complications of the operation of aging vessels. While it was ultimately up to the captain to keep the crew safe and decide when to embark, the missed deadlines, low tonnage, and costly maintenance work could end careers. There were also generous bonuses for captains who could exceed quotas. The culture of prioritizing profit over the safety of the crew was pervasive on the lakes and continued even after high-profile losses such as the Carl D. Bradley and the SS Daniel J. Morrell. So while the relatively new Captain Joppich would have preferred a new hull plating, it was decided the ship was seaworthy and the Cedarville began the 1965 season with a massive increase in tonnage required. The Great Lakes didn't care about U.S. Steel's quotas, however, and a massive cold front swept through the area. The recently cleared Mackinac Straits froze over and iced the Cedarville despite the crew's best efforts. She would have had to wait until April of that year when the weather began to cooperate to get the season going. After a few successful runs, Jopich could relax some, but the pressure to keep up was always in the back of his mind. Around the year prior to the Cedarville making it out of the ice, another vessel left Denmark destined for the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway. At the helm of this relatively young vessel, the MV Top Dalsford, was Captain Ramus Hogeland. The Top Dalsford was built 6 years prior in Gothenburg, Sweden, operated by a Norwegian shipping company. The 423 feet or 129 meter long cargo ship was built to withstand the rages of the North Sea and the North Atlantic. The bow was reinforced to help break through ice and was powered by a single diesel engine that could run 6,000 horsepower. Her cargo holds were filled with European exports bound for Canada and the United States, scheduled to return to her home port of Oslo with a load of grain from Chicago and Port Arthur, Ontario. The St. Lawrence Seaway was opened in 1959, and it allowed ships with drafts up to 26.9 feet or 8.2 meters to operate between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean, allowing Michigan access to the world through larger vessels. After braving many North Atlantic storms, the Top Dalsford would arrive in the Great Lakes and navigate the heavy waterway traffic in the channel locks. During her voyage throughout the lakes, she'd unload her cargo and prepare for the journey home. On the morning of May 7th, the vessel was sailing up Lake Michigan bound for Port Arthur, Ontario. A heavy fog had set in from the night before on the Mackinac Straits, which reduced visibility to only a few hundred feet. The fog was so dense that no captain could see the bows as they made it through. The crew had to rely only on radios, radar, and rules of the sea, as well as their senses, while they listened for foghorns in the vast stretches of the mist in front of them. Still, they moved ahead, intent on keeping the schedule, the Top Dalsford being no exception. During that morning, Jopich was commanding the ship despite the low visibility with the help of an RCA radar and radar direction finder to help establish a position. The ship also had a gyro compass and a standard radio telephone that was manned by the captain. All communication, navigation, and operational equipment was in working order. The Cedarville continued at full speed, approximately 11.7 miles an hour. Upon reaching the Mackinac Bridge, Jopich established contact with the downbound Benson Ford. A passing arrangement was verbally agreed upon, and the two ships safely passed a half-mile apart from each other. The fog was so thick that none of the lookouts could see the Benson Ford passing them. The captain would eventually make contact with a German vessel called the MV Weissenberg, establishing a port-to-port passing with her captain, Werner May. As the Weissenberg passed under the bridge, Captain May warned Jopich that there was a Norwegian vessel ahead of them. Per Great Lakes regulations, Captain Hogeland would manually operate the ship's fog whistle himself, letting out 3 short blasts at regular intervals while nearing the Mackinac Bridge. The Top Dalsford had reduced speed to compensate for the fog. On the Cedarville, Captain Jopich would also operate his fog whistle as well as make a security call to the ship's radio while they were headed towards the Straits. Captain Jopich would continue to hail the Top Dalsford as they approached but it was no use. Third mate Charles Cook had warned Joppich the ship was getting closer while watching the radar. The top Dalsford would appear on the port side of the Cedarville at 900 feet, forcing Captain Joppich to order Gabriziak, directing hard to starboard, full speed ahead, shifting the rudder port side to steer the stern away from the oncoming Norwegian freighter. Dave Erickson, a graduate of Rogers City High in 1959, signed on with the Bradley Transportation Company. He took on various jobs over a few years on the Cedarville before settling in as a porter for the galley, as off-duty weeks were more consistent for the staff involved. At 5 a.m. on May 7th, Erickson disembarked in Rogers City, which gave him some time before his shift at 7, so he took a quick nap. The morale on board was high. The crew loved overnight breaks in their home port so they could spend more time with their families and friends. After a quick breakfast, he headed for the captain's cabin to begin his shift. He reported fog being so thick he couldn't see the other end of the ship, with the fog whistle blaring at regular intervals. It was cold, around 41 degrees. As he finished his work up front, he headed back to the galley. He could hear the other ships as they neared the Straits. He had stepped out to get some potatoes when another porter, Jerome Kierzek, got his attention.
"Hey, Dave, look at this!"
They could barely see the top Dalsford looming in the fog, heading straight for the SS Cedarville. The Cedarville let out a long blast just as the top Dalsford slammed into the port side. Dave didn't recall much noise from the collision, except the ship shuddered, as if it had been struck by a large wave. The freighter's bow remained lodged in their side as the Cedarville continued forward. Dave and Jerome watched for a moment before rushing to their cabins to grab life jackets. They shared the same cabin and quickly got prepared as the ship's warning alarm started blaring. Dave checked the cabins around him to make sure no one was asleep. As he returned to the deck, he heard the sound of the bow finally breaking free and scrape alongside the Cedarville. It passed so close he could almost reach out and touch it before it disappeared into the fog. He reported to his boss on what happened before heading forward to assess the damage. Some of the railing and deck plates buckled, but most of the damage seemed to be below water. He heard water rushing underneath. The deck crew lowered an emergency collision tarpaulin along the damaged area to mitigate the flooding, but the hole was too large and the tarp was almost immediately sucked into the ship. The port side began to list as water was pumped into the starboard ballast to level it out. But it was clear to everyone on board the Cedarville knew their ship was in serious danger. The order was given to begin preparing lifeboats while the captain made an attempt to beach the ship. Dave reported to lifeboat number 1 on the starboard side and helped uncover and lower the boat on the main deck. By then, the bow was barely visible, the forward decks already awash, and the ship began listing to starboard, with the ballast tanks venting water. The SS Cedarville was making her final plunge into the lake. The crew remained calm but urgently as the bow pushed below the waves and the ship listed further starboard. Dave jumped into the lifeboat, joining several of his crewmates, but as soon as he got in, he heard shouts that the lifeboat wasn't releasing. In a split-second decision, he jumped into the water as the ship quickly capsized, rolling on top of the boat and the crew members inside it. He felt the shudder in the water as the bow hit the lake bed and the bellow of the limestone cargo spilled out of the ship. After what felt like an eternity, he made it back to the surface. The cold water made it hard for him to catch his breath, but he looked for the ship. He only saw about 150 feet of the bottom of her hull, the port side lifeboat still attached to the ship. Another crew member was desperately banging the releases with an oar, finally releasing the boat just as the Cedarville disappeared under the lake. He watched as the carrier vanished into the churning waves, the reality of what happened just setting in. He was cold and numb, held up by his life jacket. He heard the sounds of foghorns from other ships, the distance and men screaming for help from all around him. He saw a life raft and swam towards it with the men aboard lifting him out of the water. He was already too weak to pull himself up, but once on board, he tried to warm himself up while his crewmates threw ropes in the water to help others climb up. Surrounded by the eerie soup of the fog, the men waited for rescue. Accounts of what happened on the bridge within the first few minutes differed. Joppich claimed that he had already reduced speed to slow ahead, but there was little evidence of it. Others on the bridge, including the wheelsman, maintained that the ship only reduced to half speed after failing to make contact with the Topdalsfjord. The lookout, stationed on the port bridge wing, shouted,
"There she is!"
when the Norwegian vessel appeared. Another lookout stationed on the bow saw her too, shouting,
"Half a block away!"
By that point, Gabraziak could see her too, about 100 feet ahead and closing in fast. Joppich immediately ordered slow ahead, but just as he issued the order, Cook shouted,
"Captain, we're going to be hit!"
It was then Joppich ordered hard to starboard at full speed, but by then it was too late. Captain Haugland was on the starboard bridge when he heard the Cedarville's whistle. He ordered the engines to reverse, but by then the reinforced bow of the Topdalsfjord sliced through the Cedarville at an almost perfect right angle in her number 7 hatch at 9:55 on the morning of May 7th, 1965. After a few moments, the Cedarville disappeared into the fog, her momentum dislodging the two ships. Despite damage to the bow, the Topdalsfjord's crew were unharmed, and the ship wasn't in any serious danger of sinking. Her 2 lifeboats launched to search for survivors, but none were found. Within a few hours, the Topdalsfjord was informed other ships, including the Weissenberg, were aiding the Cedarville. The Topdalsfjord would sail to Sault Ste. Marie, but the true horror of what transpired only a few hundred feet away in the fog. Meanwhile, on the Cedarville, Captain Joppich sounded a general alarm, radioing a Mayday call and dropping the ship's port anchor. The collision was reported to the Mackinac Island Coast Guard Station and the nearby Wassenberg. Upon learning the Cedarville was taking on tremendous amounts of water, the emergency tarpaulin failed to slow the flooding. He ordered all crew not assisting in the engine room to report to muster and prepare the lifeboats. Captain Joppich would make an attempt to beach the Cedarville. He raised the anchor and ordered full speed ahead, the starboard ballast tanks filling up in an attempt to even out the list. Instead of heading to a closer beach or shoal, Captain Joppich tried to make it for Mackinac City. Charles Cook set a course that proved both wrong and hopelessly optimistic. The nearest shallow, Graham Shoal, was only a mile away and likely reachable, while Old Mackinac Point was an out of reach 2.2 miles. The motion only pushed the bow deeper, and it was abundantly clear the ship would be under in a matter of minutes. Still, no order to abandon ship had been given. The Cedarville would then list starboard. Gabraziak was the only one donning a life jacket immediately after the collision. As he escaped the flooding ship, he saw third mate Charles Cook struggling to put his life jacket on. He lost sight of him when the ship heeled over. Cook's body was never found. Joppich himself was pulled from the water and clinging onto his life jacket. Upon receiving the Mayday calls, Captain May of the Weissenberg followed the ship closely. While they couldn't see the Cedarville going down, they knew what had happened when the Cedarville disappeared from the radar screen, immediately launching their lifeboats for survivors. Dave Erickson's raft would be pulled up alongside the Weissenberg. The German crew helped them aboard and immediately gave them blankets and warm clothing, as well as hot coffee and tea. As Dave warmed up and regained his senses, he saw the German sailors performing CPR on some of his fellow crew members. 2 would die on the Weissenberg from shock and hypothermia. Out of the 35 crew members on the Cedarville, 10 lost their lives. All but one of the engine crew on duty went down with the ship. The other 25 were transported to the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac and brought to local hospitals. Dave was treated for his injuries and driven home to Rogers City, where he reunited with his wife and 2 children. And he and his fellow survivors spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what happened that morning. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, U.S. Steel immediately stepped in to protect its reputation after yet another ship had met its timely end. The loss of the SS Carl D. Bradley was still fresh in people's minds, and another accident blamed on poor maintenance and safety standards could prove costly. Fortunately, the aging, underpowered, poorly designed ship, along with the lack of safety culture, was easily overshadowed by the decisions of Captain Joppich. U.S. Steel quickly tried to blame the accident on the crew of the Top Dalsford. An investigation, the U.S. Coast Guard quickly turned its focus onto what happened on the Cedarville. U.S. Steel's lawyers attempted to plead the Fifth on Joppich's behalf. A federal judge ruled that the plea did not apply to maritime law, and Joppich was submitted to questioning. His testimony not only contradicted the survivors, but it contradicted what was recorded on the ship's logs and other documents. The inquiry found his testimony self-serving and largely false. Ultimately, it was decided that the Top Dalsford operated under reasonable caution by reducing speed and observing maritime passing rules. Blame for the accident and loss of life fell on Joppich, eventually leading him to plead guilty to the charges against his shipmaster's license. It was determined that the Cedarville, operating at top speed, was far too fast given the low visibility and the volume of traffic. Joppich failed to establish a radar plot or follow established track lines despite ample warning over radar, radio, and fog signals that another ship was approaching. Once the collision occurred, Joppich failed to realize the gravity of the situation despite reasonable attempts to ground the ship. He failed to plot a course to the nearest shallow. He squandered critical moments in what could have saved all lives on board. The most damning was failing to order the abandoned ship. Nearly all the engine crew remained at their stations long after it was clear the Cedarville was doomed. Though he avoided criminal liability, Joppich would be stripped of his master's license and never sailed again. Questions remain over how much U.S. Steel and its culture of profits over safety contributed to this disaster. Many survivors and living family maintained that the company created an unsafe work environment and questioned whether Joppich was even fit to serve as captain. Legal battles over liability stretched over years. The inquiry has also determined that the crew of the Weissenberg acted heroically. Captain May remained in the area even after Joppich immediately declined his help. They acted quickly to get the crew out of the water as soon as possible. With the low visibility and the colder temperatures, it was clear the death toll would have been higher if not for their actions. The Cedarville itself would eventually be considered another casualty of the Great Lakes, overshadowed, of course, by the Edmund Fitzgerald and other ships later on. The SS Cedarville now lies upside down at the bed of Lake Huron. It is a popular, though dangerous, diving site and a ghastly reminder of the risky sailor's life on the Great Lakes side. This episode has been dedicated to the memory of the 10 crew members who lost their lives on May 7th, 1965, and to the memories of Ed Brewster, who rejoined his crewmates in 2009, Leonard Gabriziak, who rejoined his crewmates in 2019, and Dave Erickson in 2021. May they all rest in a well-deserved peace. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to like and subscribe, and may the fair winds guide you through dangerous times.